suggested, they're all pretty much in the same area in Soho. And that had been earlier the home to Herman Leff Stationery in the 19th and early 20th century, and presently there's a small restaurant, somebody noted, not a very distinguished one, it didn't get very many stars, but it's called called Olives. The second was United Brush Manufactories. Again, is meant to be pretty self-explanatory. It's at 116, 118 Worcester Street, again between Prince and Spring, so it's around the corner. United Brush Manufactories goes back into the 1930s. It was a factory seller of brushed brooms. It's presently a space that has various boutiques and other things. Barney's Co-op is there. There's another boutique in the air, designer department stores. The upper 3 floors are residential. The third of the fragments is the big white building that you saw. It's most of Soho is distinguished, as you know, because of its cast iron architecture. This is really considered one of the grander of all the cast iron architectures. The king of Green Street. It's at 7276 Green Street. It was constructed in 1873 and originally served as a warehouse for a dry goods dealing with Gardner Colby Company. And current use, the bottom floor, one person reminds me, is a Droog. It changes every year, so the boutiques come and go so quickly in that area. Designer clothing and home decor store, as well as an espresso bar, etc. Let's see, there were 2 others. Fragment 4, I gave you the whole piece to make life easier, rather than just the top of the building. It's the Manhattan Bistro, so that was a kind of giveaway. The interesting part is its history and its past. It's often on mystery tours because there was a well there. It was the site of a supposed murder, and the house is supposedly haunted, or the site is haunted from the turn of the last century. The bistro is there now. And the last one, of course, was that one, the Manhattan Bistro, is at 129 Spring Street. The last one back on Prince Street, 103 Prince Street, was the post office, which all of you now know is the first of the Apple stores that's in Manhattan. For that game, let me see. The winner was Eric Ottenberg. Eric here? Eric?
I won before.
It doesn't matter. I've got something for everybody.
How many slides was this?
This is it. Yeah, go to the next. There was going to be music in, so you can see if we can put the music in. Those were the slides we were just looking at. The next one would be music, so we'll hold it. It'll come up automatically if I have it loaded properly. Is this the one that I gave you last time that I told you to load?
Oh, I see what you mean.
If not, then it won't load. So don't worry about it. Let's see. The best new fragments on this really were quite terrific. It wasn't the winner. Was Mark Levy. I don't know if you can see the fragments. The first one is on Duane Street. It's the home of the Weber Cheese Company. It's simply the clock at the top, which is a wonderful example of a fragment that you look at and then try to find the building. And the one below it, no, I'm sorry, it's from the A.T. Stewart the first one at the top is from the Stewart Dry Goods store. A.T. Stewart is the first of the big department stores. And the second one is from 172 Duane Street, the home of Weber Cheese, present use its law offices. Is Mark here? The number of cupcakes gets diminished in each one. And let's see, I had then some honorable mentions to, let's see, Zach Tawatari? Zach, all right, in the back, and Ayakiri. Yes. Okay, good. You have to choose, however. You get to choose one.
Okay.
Pick one.
Take this one. Thank you.
And you get the last one.
Oh, thank you.
These are These are Melissa's creations of, which is on 14th Street, quite a nice little place. Okay, anything else then about the midterm, the final, wherever we are? The grades will go up to supposedly 2 days afterwards. I think that's 48 hours after the 10th. We'll do our best to make that happen. Okay? All righty. Last lecture. Lots of material to cover. I want to go over. New York City cosmopolitanism. New York City, as we've tried to emphasize, was a city that was the center of diversity. Oh, I know what I wanted to say to you. I wanted to say something about the final exam and about thinking about the final exam. Someone asked me, how would one study? Well, one of the things to think about in terms of this material as you're reviewing it is to try to distinguish between those kinds of things which you think of as common to the American story and those things that are unique about New York City. So if we were talking about something, for instance, around gender, the cult of true womanhood is part of a dominant ideology that penetrates all of American culture. If we were talking about gay New York, on the other hand, there might be a young gay man living in Southern Ohio. It does happen. But it's likely they would find themselves in a small community and relatively isolated, and people like that gravitated and came to places like New York, which was a large metropolitan, diverse city in which they could find a community of like-minded people. And in New York, as a consequence, was a beacon for not just diversity, but for multiple and alternative lifestyles. It was a place where people could engage in the area we've talked about around here with Bohemia, with countercultures, with alternative cultures, yet they would be juxtaposed to citadels, to centers of the dominant culture, Wall Street just a few blocks away. Immigrants would come here, but they would find like-minded folks here in large numbers in Queens. The Number 7 train film that I showed you last time showed you how through chain migration people go back and they say, well, where do the Koreans live? And then go to find that kind of community. Not uncommon kind of story, made New York different. So a lot of the kinds of things you're thinking about, gender occurs everywhere, but how is that story shaped differently by seasonal labor, garment industry, by the size of the population, by alternative lifestyles that engage questions around gay sexuality, around homosexuality, around issues around free love, around women's role, and they're distinctly honored, those questions, and they're raised in New York City relative to other places. You want to do that kind of parallel work around the other kinds of questions, thinking about what kinds of features are in fact unique to New York City in this story. We've heard how women's liberation, the gay, lesbian, transgendered communities and others organize. The same thing occurred, of course, for Puerto Ricans. They organized in the Young Lords. The Asian American community organized, and I've even suggested how you all can see that around you at NYU or any other university that now has areas of the curriculum that are dedicated to those communities, to studying them, to articulating the role and place that they have in the American mosaic. And so we have Asian Pacific American studies and Latino studies and Africana studies and gay and sexuality studies, none of which would have necessarily existed prior. Well, they didn't exist prior to 1970 on the whole, and they existed in part because those communities demanded that their voices be incorporated into the story of America and the story of New York City. All, in fact, built lasting cultural, educational, political, and health institutions, if you think of the gay men's health crisis. And they did so especially in New York City, where they were here in large numbers, and there was a kind of political consciousness that's articulated in New York. This achievement came as a legacy of community organizing, and community organizing from below. But as I tried to suggest at the end of last lecture, there was often pushback. Not everyone in New York City was willing to embrace those forms of organization. And ironically, pushback could come in the forms of community organizing from the top down or from other constituencies that were below. They could come from the middle. They could come from people who were saying, we're not the dispossessed, we're not the poor, but we're hardworking middle-class people, and taxes are not going to us, and we're going to organize. And damn it, we want to be treated as well as, in fact, minorities are being treated. So there could be pushback and community organizing that can inform the working class communities and white ethnic communities of the outer boroughs as well. It's not something that informs simply the Black Power movement or Latino power or gay power. And this kind of organizing and conflict between these different groups grew particularly in the 70s and 80s and forward into the 90s. And in New York City, it often resulted in extraordinarily rather poignant conflicts. We'll talk about some of these, but let me talk a little bit, if I can, beforehand about diversity. Because the diversity was not simply about different ethnicities. It was not simply about different races. It was also about inequality. We were different in the ways, in the different kind of social groups that we had and the interests that they often had. That, by the way, is a story you may recall from the 17th century when we talked about it between landowners and merchants, all of whom were vested in different forms of taxes that would serve their own interests. So it's not an entirely new story. But the inequality now, and the conflict was not just between two groups of rich folks, landowners and merchants, it was also between rich and poor. And nowhere was that set in more graphic relief than in New York City and in Manhattan in particular. We talked about Manhattan being the county in the United States in the new millennium that had greater inequality than any other county in the entire United States. Now, not only was that inequality here, but we've also talked and suggested how from the early 70s forward, there is increasingly a sense of difference between what it meant to be in Manhattan, by which they usually meant below 125th Street, and the outer boroughs, Queens, Brooklyn, white ethnics, who often thought Manhattan was full of liberals who were privileging the poor at the expense of hardworking, tax-paying white ethnics who wanted to hold on to their jobs and pass them on to their sons and daughters, police, firemen, construction, the stories we talked about last time. So difference was not just about inequality, it was also about the different communities that were often quite isolated from one another. But they were communities in which boundaries, because of the rapid expansion in the population I mentioned last time, of 1 million people in the last decade, in which the boundaries are increasingly porous. People need new housing, and so what may have been Chinatown suddenly becomes a little bit of Little Italy, or maybe all of Little Italy, starts to engulf the other areas. And that creates even further conflict. That is about housing, it's about cultures, it's about power. Let's begin with diversity and see the different stories. It comes from unique migration stories, so I suggested that patterns of immigration changed dramatically and reshaped New York after 1965. But it's important that we understand that it shaped it very differently for very different groups of people, including among those migrants. And the number 7 train, I think, is quite wonderful in beginning to suggest the difference, that not all immigrant groups or individuals experienced New York in quite the same way. Dominicans were the largest group to come here. Again, remember, the '65 law capped 20,000 annually. But because you could come as well with kinship ties above 20,000 because of family repatriation, as many as over 50,000 came in some years. 1994 counted 51,000 Dominicans. 60% of those folks, 6 out of every 10, not 60% of each person, 6 out of every 10 settled in Washington Heights. And that number, it's been suggested by sociologists, was probably undercounted by 50%. So there may have been as many as 600,000 people there. The early migrants came after the assassination of the dictator Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. So they are increasingly political refugees and middle-class people coming in the early migration pattern. The later Dominicans who come in the 80s and 90s are part of chain migration, and they tend to be people fleeing poverty. So there are even differences by generation within the Dominican population. It's important to understand. By the 1990s, in fact, the Dominican population is not characterized so much by the early migrants who are more affluent, but by the later migrants. And the Dominican population in New York has the lowest level of entrepreneurship among the ethnic immigrants and declining per capita income. So they are a relatively poor group that settled here. The Chinese are again a varied story. After 1965, what we're calling Chinese immigrants were in fact Taiwanese. They're not coming from what in America was referred to as Red China. They're coming from anti-Red China, the Taiwan Republic offshore. Okay? Later, INS, Naturalization Service, gave equal quotas to the Chinese, and they also had 20,000. And initially, coming from Taiwan, these are skilled and professional folks. And many of them are coming here and staying on student visas. Many others who come afterwards, as they begin to come from the mainland on visas, find themselves working in restaurants and garments. And so the settlement of the Chinese is in fact quite polar. There is a high professional technical group that plays a major role in the New York economy, and a very large unskilled group that you'll find if you go into the restaurants in Chinatown. They're the ones clearing your tables, okay, taking orders. The Filipinos, again an interesting case. Not going to mention all, needless to say. Half of the immigrant nurses to New York City are in fact Filipinos. Why? Because it had a colonial background and was English speaking, because it was an American colony. And so in fact a large number of people had gotten training in the Philippines and now could come to the US. And remember, the original 65 Act was privileging people who had skills, who we needed. Medical skills were a high priority. West Indian immigrants, or Afro-Caribbeans more generally. Jamaicans, the United Kingdom, Jamaica was part of the United Kingdom. But the United Kingdom starts to limit immigration from Jamaica in 1962, and the US then opens it in 1965. So in fact, the US becomes a major source, a major port for Jamaican immigrants rather than London or Liverpool. Most black immigrants to the United States in the last half of the 20th century into New York City are from the Caribbean. They are not African. Okay? The majority. That doesn't mean there aren't there aren't others, okay? But the majority were from the Caribbean. The Jamaicans had a real advantage. They're English speaking, Anglophone, with a British accent, even sounded relatively cultured to people here. Unlike the Dominicans and Haitians, they get a reputation very early as well-educated, skilled, and hard workers. And they do, in fact, better than most other Caribbeans in getting jobs and getting skilled jobs in the New York economy. Though, it should be noted, below that of white ethnics. Okay? But they're at the top of that Afro-Caribbean pyramid. Many of them get work in the service, in the healthcare industry, healthcare service. We contrast their experience with another group of Afro-Caribbeans, Haitians. They, first of all, had very black skin, blacker skin than often other people from the Caribbean. And blackness mattered both in the Caribbean and in the United States. Racism exists in the Caribbean. It exists in how black you are or how white your blackness is. And it tends to privilege the less black. So if you look on television stations in most Caribbean and Latin American countries, the newscasters tend to be more light-skinned than what you'll otherwise see around the streets. Haitians initially come, they are first of all not English-speaking, they're French-speaking, which makes their integration more difficult. They also have very low skill level. They also flee a dictatorship. Their dictator was Duvalier, Papa Doc he was known as. But their response, of course, they come as boat people, is that they're incarcerated, they're not welcomed. The Center for Disease Control identifies them as a population at risk with HIV/AIDS, which, as you know, was very little understood but had created quite a mania in the United States in response, especially during the Reagan presidency. It leads, in fact, to the stigmatizing of the Haitian population in New York. Even as late as 2002, Bush detains rather than grants asylum to Haitians trying to immigrate to the United States. We contrast them with yet a third group, Cubans. They also flee a dictatorship. They are welcomed. They come by boats. Their boats are led ashore. Their history reflects the legacy of the Cold War as it continued to shape immigration patterns. The early migration of Cubans was professional and property, white-collar, well-educated people fleeing the socialist regime, communist regime in Cuba, which was privileging the proletariat or the unskilled or the laborers, the unpropertied classes. They are, of course, embraced and welcomed, and they are the first generation of Cubans. They're both in New Jersey and they're Miami and they're in New York. The second generation, the later generation, is the Mariel immigration, M-A-R-I-E-L. And it's in the mid-90s, and these are boat people, and they are also fleeing, but they are fleeing after Castro, somewhat maliciously, lets them out of jail. Not because they are political prisoners, but because often they are criminals. They are, as it's described by Americans, the riffraff, male, young prisoners, the insane, working class, and often more marginal. Most, again, go to Miami, but there are strong communities in New York City, especially in the metropolitan area, Union City, West New York, Patterson. The Cuban community on the whole has a higher income than any other Latino community in the United States. It is, in fact, welcomed. It has at its base a high skill level group that helps through chain migration and through family contacts to help the later migrants get established. And the 1990 census has the average U.S. Cuban family income at over $41,000, while that for Mexicans and those from Guatemala is about $25,000. So it's almost 50% above that of many of the other immigrants in large numbers coming from Central America. Cuban education averaged 16.5 years. For other Latinos, it was 9 years. So again, to give you an example of the kind of advantage that they brought with them when they arrived that helps them secure a place in the community. One last group I want to mention briefly, I think, is Vietnamese, because they also come as boat people. But they are also allowed in, unlike the Haitians, because they are fleeing not a right-wing regime, but a left-wing regime. So the rule of thumb generally was that if you came from Cuba, Vietnam, and were fleeing a left-wing regime, you were welcomed. If you fled a right-wing regime, the doors were closed to you. The Vietnamese story was complicated because a lot of them are Eurasians. That's to say, they are the product of relationships that American soldiers had with Vietnamese women in Vietnam. And those children were not welcomed in Vietnamese society because they were stigmatized as products of an American imperial story, as it was remembered. So the vast majority of Asian refugees to the United States from 1975 to the early 2000s are in fact Vietnamese fleeing political repression after they had served in the U.S. Army or after they had been children of U.S. Army soldiers. The story as a whole, though, means that New York and immigration has a third world profile at the end of the 20th century that it doesn't have in the 19th century. It is no longer merely white Europeans. There are some. The Russian community is a classic example, Russian Jews. Okay, so the Poles, the Irish working in the construction industry. So there are plenty of Northern Europeans coming. They are in small numbers compared to those now coming from Latin America, South America, Africa, and the Caribbean and Asia. South Asia as well as East Asia. Secondly, as I suggested last time, legals, those who are legal, are often privileged in that group. But what constituted the legals was dramatically different than it had been in the 19th century. Where the legal were often the poor, the legal are now often the affluent, or the better prepared, those with skills that we wanted, the brain drain. The illegal now are those crossing the border, both because they're trying to escape poverty and because employers want them for low-paid labor, sometimes seasonal labor in godforsaken places like Arizona. Actually, a beautiful state, if you're white. The policy creates a new illegal category that most resembles the traditional immigrants, but now stigmatizes rather than welcomes them. Though, as I mentioned, and it's worth repeating, employers quietly are only too happy to employ these people for low wages. 6 hours, 10, 12 hours a day, and often, as you saw, $250 to $400 a week. If you did your math, you know that that was not a lot to live on for a year. So we're left in the late 20th century with a disparity of social conditions shaping now the social history of a multicultural New York City. And we need to understand we need to ask, how are these people greeted? What's the policy that shapes how they're now to be integrated into New York City life, welcomed, treated, assimilated, controlled? The median household income in New York City at the end of the 20th century is roughly $40,000. It fluctuates a little bit. Again, to remind you, the sense of the city, about 13% of the population earned, and this is again, I'm talking about at the new millennium, 2000, just as a marker from that census year, about 13% earned more than $150,000. So that was an elite sector. And you know, we're talking about 1 or 2% that are millionaires. 46.4% earn less than $35,000. Okay? So again, remember, the median income is $40,000. $35,000 is earned by about 40. The number I had was 46.4%. So it's above the poverty line. These people would work in service to the rich largely. They clean our offices. They're the nannies for our children. They wash the slop off our plates in restaurants. That's to say, we're all implicated in one another's lives. We see these people all the time.
What year?
This is all 19. This is 2000.
2000.
2000. New York City has been said by historians who have studied this, some of whom I've given you to read, is described as beginning to resemble in its social and economic profile third world cities. That is to say, cities with a very small slice of very rich people, characterized first world and second world cities, of which New York was a premier city at the end of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. The manufacturing base is eviscerating, is disappearing, and instead what we have is an increasingly large service class, leisure industry, cleaning of buildings, parks, working in banks, but it's tellers. Well, we hardly see tellers anymore. Who knows what they clean banks? I think there are very few tellers. Who here has gone to a teller in the last 6 months? That's about right. Well, maybe 10 or 15% of us. We all use ATMs, right? Everything's automated in what we do. Many of the poor are, in fact, black, where poverty is accompanied by a second problem, of course, often crime. That's to say, these are people who often live in the worst housing. They're people who live often at the margins of society. And we know that the criminal justice system finds us with black urban prisoners largely being contained by white rural jailers. It's called the prison industrial complex. Most of these prisons are not in New York, but prisoners from New York City now live in upstate prisons, where, by the way, they can't vote. They're part of the voting districts down here. It's a very complicated disenfranchisement that goes on in the voting districts. And the jailers up there are often people in white poverty who are dependent on black prisoners for the jobs that they have. So it's a group of people who grow up never knowing the kinds of people who are the prisoners and then find themselves having to administer and contain and supervise these people. It's a very combustible situation and a desperate one, both for the people in rural areas who need jobs as well as for people down here who may want to visit their loved ones who are incarcerated very far away. It's estimated that 1 out of every 3 black men in New York City exists the turn of the century in some relationship to the criminal justice system. What the story of immigration that I traced for you earlier suggests is how some immigrants are in fact privileged by policy and some are discriminated by policy. And we saw in the number 7 train how some could embrace the city, like the gay Pakistani sari salesman. Others were deeply embittered, like the fish seller, who looked forward to saving enough money and then getting the hell out of Dodge, returning to his homeland. The irony of the late 19th century city is that new immigrants from Asia and the Caribbean are left to fight over the pieces with old minorities, African Americans and Puerto Ricans. And with those next on the bottom, lower middle class white ethnics. And all of those people are fighting over the jobs that are left, especially when unemployment can be 10 or 15%. Is this new? No, not entirely. You'll remember the draft riots. And you'll remember the draft riots were on the heels of conflict over jobs on the dock lands earlier. So this also is not a new story. The players are new. The players are new. As important, the community, as I've suggested earlier, is not simply the province of minorities or the poor. The tools of Saul Alinsky are as much to be used by both sides in these conflicts. And ironically, in the post-70 era, in the late 60s, community organizing is done on behalf often of minorities, African Americans, gay rights, women's rights, Latinos. In the 70s and 80s, it's a tool often used by white ethnics in the outer boroughs, defending their communities against those who would come in and take their houses and lower their housing values as they see it, or destroy their schools as they see it, or bring crime into their neighborhood as they imagined it. Forest Hills, 1972, was the earliest of those kinds of conflicts. Some of you know about it because it's where Mario Cuomo, in fact, made his name, the former governor. The city had been told in 1966 that it had to place, again during the period of the Great Society, the city was told by the federal government that it had to place 7,500 blacks in middle-income neighborhoods or risk losing federal funds. Say the city was being told that the problems of segregation were not just Southern problems, they're Northern problems. And cities like Boston, in New York, in Philadelphia, were now being told, you've got to integrate your schools, you've got to integrate your neighborhoods. And you can imagine Southern white politicians were thrilled at this idea that Northerners were now going to have to face the same problems. The city's mayor in '68, who now had to implement this, was Lindsay, who was a liberal patrician, as you recall, from the Silk Stocking District. So he proposes to build this low-income housing project, and low income meant black, disproportionately, black families on welfare, and put them in a middle-income Jewish neighborhood, Forest Hills. The conflict, as you can imagine, got ugly. The first thing everyone would raise would be cries of, NIMBY, not in my backyard. Do it in Queens, do it in Manhattan. Mr. Lindsay, put them on the Upper East Side, if you feel you want to have them. Okay? Lindsay's choice was Queens. For Queens, the idea of scatter site housing for blacks was an abomination, especially since it was being done by liberal Manhattanites who were refusing to put them in their own neighborhood. Though the argument would have been argued, well, Harlem is right next door and the Lower East Side is right next door, that Manhattan already had its scatter site housing. But as I've already tried to suggest, what Manhattan actually had were isolated communities. The Lower East Side was isolated and insular and protected. Greenwich Village was isolated, insular, and protected. How? Realtors and high prices. That's what keeps people out. The banks won't make loans, the realtors won't show people the housing, and the prices were prohibitive. So what you had were islands. Mario Cuomo, the law professor at Queens, at St. John's, was called in to mediate. He was a Catholic, he was a progressive, and it was hoped that he would be able to talk to people in Queens. And indeed he was able to, and he helps to set up a compromise. The compromise, however, was moderate. It built a few houses, much smaller in density, much smaller in scale. The real denouement, or the real end of the story, was in fact that the experiments at scatter site housing are ended with the defeat of Hubert Humphrey by Richard Nixon in 1968 in the backlash. And Richard Nixon effectively ends the story by ending the federal housing program. That becomes the real answer. And changing it instead to building housing, giving poor people vouchers. Giving black people vouchers and said, go find your own house. And the voucher program that remains in place today, rather than building housing, comes from the early 1970s, put in place by the Nixon administration and maintained. There's never been the kind of widespread, large-scale housing for the poor that was developed, indeed, in part from the monies that people like Robert Moses helped to corner for New York City. Wasn't always very attractive housing, and we know it was actually done badly, but it was done then. The new plan was, in fact, to give people money and let them find a place. And of course, the answer is they could only find places where landlords and others were prepared to rent to them. The conflicts, places like Forest Hills, would in fact be replicated in community after community, including places like Canarsie that you'll be reading, that you've read about. I hope by now you've read about. The conflicts would continue. but they'd be shaped by new fiscal realities and these new social policies put in place after the mid-70s. With the end of the Great Society, with the change of federal policy where New York could no longer corner monies, and in which the center of New York power had shifted from Manhattan, from the counterculture of the 60s, increasingly to the new alliance of white ethnics in the outer boroughs, Staten Island, Queens, and Brooklyn in particular. They would be the people who would help to support the election of the new mayors from being forward, with a small exception being Dinkins for a 4-year term in the early 90s. And we'd end up now instead with Democratic and Republican mayors who were committed to a policy that fairly resembled the policy associated with both Reagan and Clinton, that's often described as neoliberalism, a new kind of commitment to public and private partnerships, which really represented privatization of public services. There was a fiscal crisis in 1976 that some of you know about. Its origins lay in the fact that this was an old city. I asked you to read David Gordon's article several weeks ago that suggested the ways in which many people had often been complaining about the problems of New York were its profligacy. It was just giving away too much, too many benefits. And he demonstrates, he was an economist at the New School before he died, that New York's benefits were not, in fact, disproportionate to most other states. What was disproportionate was its income, was its tax base, and its infrastructure. And that made cities like New York unlike new cities like a Phoenix, like a Houston, like Los Angeles. It can't simply annex areas into which white middle-class taxpayers have moved and incorporate them into the tax base of the city, so people could flee the tax base, simply come in and use the city for the theater or to make money at Wall Street, and then go back out in the suburbs and pay New Jersey and Westchester and Nassau County for their taxes. So the tax base disappears because New York City can't expand. It can't expand in part because of rivers. Very hard to decide we're going to take over part of New Jersey. Okay? And it can't expand north and east because the state legislature controls annexation, controls those kinds of divisions, those kinds of movements. The second thing to remember is that New York City is built in the 19th century. It expands dramatically in the 19th century. We talked about, for instance, the reservoir. We talked about sewers. We talked about a rail system. The tragedy of we talked, for instance, about a subway. The subway system is built a century ago. If you were to go to a place like Washington, D.C., which is a new old city, you have a relatively new subway, and some of you who have gone there can see the difference it can make. Building a subway or repairing subways in New York City, or building a new subway like the 2nd Avenue subway, if it ever does get built, is incredibly expensive. Okay? It tears up the streets, tears up a very dense housing fabric above it. So New York City's problems are enormously different than they are from other cities in what we would call the Sun Belt rather than the Rust Belt. The boundaries are limited and its finance and the fiscal catchment area is limited. Its problems are complicated by the fact that the problems are nonetheless real. And a lot of the mayors, in order to meet this, start overestimating the revenues they're going to get from taxes. And they start spending, and New York City debt increases substantially. There's an interest in increasing debt because people who buy those bonds are going to get very high interest rates back from them. So people are often quite willing to make those kinds of loans. The city debt increases between 1961 and 1975 3 times. And the cost of repayment for the city increases 500%. Most cities, by the way, are doing this. But most cities don't have to do it to the extent to which New York does because of its problems. And because federal monies are no longer forthcoming. The federal government's new policy is that resources should be given to small communities to spend as they will. And those small communities now are not spending them on housing. The policy under Nixon, they're spending them on police. Not unlike the answer that we got after the draft riots, okay? Spending them more on police. The answer in New York was something called moral obligation bonds, a device conceived by Nelson Rockefeller, his Wall Street lawyer friend, a man by the name of John Mitchell. Some of you will know from Watergate fame. The bonds allowed the city to simply continue to borrow beyond its means with high repayments. So New York City's plight then is complicated in the mid-70s. It's complicated by financial problems. It's complicated by its inability to both create a new tax base, and it's complicated by a financial solution that Wall Street lawyers may have liked, but the average taxpayer was going to place an enormous burden on the taxpayers. Nixon, Ford, and other later presidents continue to see New York City as a symbol of American liberalism. And therefore, their inclination is not to want to give money to New York. As far as they're concerned, the problem New York has is a problem of New York's profligacy. New York is overspent. That New York hasn't saved for a rainy day. In some sense, their response is that would have been articulated by William Graham Sumner in Social Darwinism. What do you do when you help the poor? Do you give them money? No. Because the reason they're poor is because they're lazy, or they haven't been industrious, or they've spent their money foolishly, and they'll just continue to spend the money foolishly. So it doesn't pay to give them money. Okay? Give the money to hardworking people who will use it properly, not to cities. Put it back in people's pockets. And so they tended to give tax relief, usually for the richer than the poor, because they believed it would, quote, trickle down to the poor. The end of Vietnam shifted money to middle America. Less money for housing, more for police, more for roads. Again, remember, those construction worker hard hats were very much tied to the Nixon administration. And New York City, when it asked for money, as you know, was told simply to drop dead. It is bailed out. It's bailed out by New York City unions, which commit pension funds to bail out the city's credit loss, which the bankers had effectively, it meant paying off the bankers at their high interest rates. The bankers made out like bandits, but I think that's probably a contradiction in terms. An oxymoron, I say. The bankers took credit for creating the solvency. It effectively was really solved by the unions that gave all their pension money for it. The policy put in place afterwards was what's been called neoliberalism, and I want to talk a little bit about that legacy. The mayor's office, the city social policy would remain in the hands of neoconservatives, politicians supported by white ethnics, meaning both Jews and Catholics, Italians, Irish, Poles, Eastern Europeans as a base. Neoliberalism is usually associated with Reaganism and Thatcherism in England and the United States. It is a political project and a philosophy that governs social policy toward the poor, toward the problem of how do you deal with poverty. Its answer was a political economic model that rejected Keynesian economics of the New Deal that had continued to be articulated in the Great Society, any major role for government, and revises older ideas associated with the free market or with laissez-faire liberalism celebrated in the 19th century. It's most associated actually with Milton Friedman and the University of Chicago School of Economics Department. These are folks who come to dominate the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the presidency, and the New York City Mayor's office. They represent the place of this philosophy in world economic development, but also in New York City's economic development. It meant first and foremost the reduction of the public sector, meaning government, and transferring power into the private hands, what we call privatization. It would be lionized in what would be called public-private partnerships, which in practice meant usually business interests in a local community forming their own organization, economic development or trust, business development team. It happens in unions in most of these squares, and then getting money from the state government that would be given to that group to use as they wish. So it's state funding for private use in their notion of what constitutes the best welfare for the local community. So it's the local businessmen deciding they'll clean up Union Square, but they'll also decide what does it mean to be cleaned up. It may mean just getting rid of the homeless rather than finding jobs for the homeless. One of the things that it does is that it does clean up the parks, but it alleviates the city of any expense for doing that cleaning up. So the city doesn't often provide the same services to areas that don't have a local business community. So the areas that tend to be cleaned up are areas where local communities of businessmen are prepared to mobilize and organize. The other irony, of course, is that the state actually grows through all of this period enormously, both in the budget and its bureaucracy. There are more police, there are more firemen than ever before. They tend to be a regulatory set of groups, just not regulating Wall Street. They regulate social lives instead. So there is a reduction of regulation, but it's of the environment and it's of business. And it presumes instead that growth comes from free, unregulated intervention. New privatization of services, CUNY, now charges tuition and ends open enrollment. Schools are privatized now as what are called charter schools. These, ironically, again, take elements of community control, that idea, but in private hands, and combine them with principles of the celebration of the private sector. And they have one decided advantage. They are allowed to reject any difficult case they wish. Okay? A charter school can decide that the difficult cases stay in the public system. We know as late as last week, in the most recent study of private schools, that they, in fact, while the ideology remains one of there's great fanfare associated with the charter schools, they, in fact, are failing at a higher rate than the public schools presently. Of course, more needs to be learned. Public-private partnerships for development, I talked about already, are really, as I've suggested, state subsidies and grants of authority to corporate interests. Finally, or next, crime. In this social policy, it is reimagined again as personal failures rooted in cultures. It's no longer tied to creating housing. It's not tied to a welfare system. Instead, it becomes a workfare system. It's tied to the moral failures of individuals who have to be taught how to get up at 9 o'clock in the morning and go to work every day. It doesn't presume that there may not be jobs for them when they finish with the workfare program, because it isn't tied to any notion that there is anything called structural unemployment. It's not about the structures of society, it's about your personal weakness. It's your failure, not society's failure. We need to make you into a better person, and then you'll get a job. It should be noted, crime does diminish. rather substantially. And Giuliani and others take claim for it in New York, though the data we have suggests that broken windows, the policy of arresting people for minor offenses, takes place across the country, and that the crime diminishes across the country and in some other cities more than even in New York, who aren't involved in the same policies as Giuliani. That Giuliani isn't doing anything different than anybody else. The real difference seems to be that the drug pipeline is cut back, that cocaine, which had become epidemic in the poor communities as a means of subsistence, one is because it was a source of income. Selling drugs was profitable. And it creates a large level of dependence in which people need to commit crimes in order to have more money to buy drugs. So drugs become implicated earlier in a cycle of economy and part of the economy. But the drug pipeline is substantially cut off. Instead, it's primarily marijuana, other things. Why does it get cut off? We don't know entirely, but we think in good part the needle scare associated with HIV/AIDS may have had as much to do with it as anything else. That part of the problem with using drugs, and we know this was true because it wasn't simply the poor, it wasn't just the gay community was the first community to be hit with the AIDS epidemic, but we know that by the 90s it was disproportionately an epidemic among poor black men with needles, using needles. So as much as closing off drugs, an international drug cartel and warfare may have played a role, we know that on the whole, drugs still continues to flourish, both in Mexico, South America, Afghanistan, the Middle East, and it's very much a part of military strategies about which the government remains ambivalent. HIV/AIDS may have been as important as anything. But there is one other legacy, of course, with which we do live. It is a new regime of surveillance. More police, more threats. It's based on the notion that fear deters crime. It presumes, as in fact this form of neoconservatism always did, that Hobbesian human nature, which associates man as a beast, requires that all men have to be contained. We have to have our natural instincts are in fact to maul one another, to steal, to rob, to plunder. And that the only reason we won't do it is for fear that if we do it, we'll end up in jail. That there are no human instincts that are contrary to Hobbesian nature.
Did you say all of this is part of the neoconservatism?
They play hand in hand with it, yes. They work together. Neoliberalism really is associated with privatization, but a neoconservative philosophy, and conservatism, which is very much at home with this Hobbesian view, reinforces it, and it works hand in glove with neoliberalism. Okay. Conflicts continue, and they shape and this neoliberal attitude shapes the response. Crown Heights riot. August 1991. 3-day riot in a diverse Brooklyn community, which is home to Caribbean Americans and West Indians. They make up about 50% of the population. African Americans are another 40%, and then 10% or so Hasidic Jews. The conflict begins after a Guyanese boy is accidentally struck by a car driven by a Hasid by the name of Yosef Lifesh. It was part of a motorcade for a prominent rabbi. The man who drives the car was simply trying to keep up with the motorcade, which had been in fact led by a police escort, and he had raced through a light. The events, in fact, are murky, as they are in most of these cases. I'm not going to tell you that we actually know with any finality what happened and who's responsible. We do know some of the things that happened. The crowd began to yell, "Jew, Jew, Jew." The police, we know, had the ambulance take Yosef away, the guy driving the car, while the young black man who was hit and was pinned under the car would die while waiting for an ambulance. So the crowd could see, on the one hand, not knowing responsibility, that the white Jew was escorted to safety, the young black man was not. The riot was viewed by Hasidic Jews as a pogrom, as something that they remembered from their parents, from stories their parents had told and their grandparents had told about life in Eastern Europe and anti-Semitism. It was viewed by blacks, Afro-Caribbean blacks, as a result of biased police, who in this story, of course, are white ethnics in that alliance with the white Jew. What's the context? Well, it's worth remembering that many in the neighborhood believed that Hasidic Jews were moving in and taking over the neighborhood and buying up property. So it was a matter that it was, in fact, a community that had been identified as largely Afro-Caribbean, and Jews were beginning to move in and buy land. So there was a sense that one's turf was being invaded. The riot lasted 3 days. Jewish homes were identified because they had mezuzahs on their doors, and they were targeted. Non-residents joined locals in looting and attacking stores. They attacked homes, and they attacked the police. 152 police and 38 civilians were injured. 27 vehicles were destroyed. 7 stores were burned or looted. There were 225 cases of robbery reported. 129 people were arrested. 122 of them were blacks. Property damage was estimated at $1 million. All of which is only to say that the conflicts we had seen earlier continue. They continue now. They have both racial and ethnic character. They reflect the kind of culture wars that are going on a national level over whether over in museums, over questions about sexuality. But they're being played out in local communities over simply the preservation of one's community, and about whether or not people are being exploited, whether people are moving into their neighborhood, and whether those people are then going to own the shops that are going to charge them twice as much. A mixed race grand jury, in fact, acquits the Jewish driver. But the impact on the mayor's race in 1993, Dinkins, who had been elected to bring peace to the city, had clearly not brought peace to the city. And Jews and whites all begin to blame Dinkins, the black mayor, for failing to restore order. And he loses to a law and order campaign run by Giuliani. And we know that, in fact, increasingly the Lubavitcher Jews move into Crown Heights and establish a major presence there. And that becomes possible. So from 92 to the present, really, a neoliberal social policy dominates the city when Dinkins is not in office, after Dinkins. During the reign of Giuliani, there's an economic turndown which straps the poor in a regime of discipline, from broken windows to surveillance. Ultimately, Giuliani would gain a reputation at the end of his term for striding through the World Trade Center site. Somewhat recklessly, we now know, given the health hazards. But the regime itself, his years as mayor, were actually marked not by that last moment, but they were marked by, in fact, a rather profound conservative policy that alienated liberal Manhattan and peoples of color and appealed to white ethnics in the outer boroughs as a law and order mayor. He opposed, again, police review boards, and he ran on moral crusades against the Brooklyn Museum of having a sex exhibit, closing down prostitution, or making sure that there wouldn't be any pornography shops too close to schools or other things, that many saw as the new attack on free speech as his legacy. Broken windows, in fact, jailed many on minor charges, though they often found they had outstanding warrants. Jails and the criminal justice system during this period in the 60s becomes hyper-racialized. It was always racialized. In the 19th century, it was racialized as Irish poor, who were not quite white. Now it's hyper-racialized as almost overwhelmingly black and black Hispanic as they're being seen. Those in jail and with well-publicized incidents in which black men at the end of hails of bullets, sometimes by white vigilantes like Getz, the subway vigilante, who goes unpunished, while the police are vindicated by white juries. The case of Abner Louima, Amadou Diablo, Sean Bell. Stories from 97, 99, as late as 06. So the irony of 9/11 for New York is that while mayors, and in fact white America generally, which had critical, if not hostile, opinions about the city and would tell it to drop dead in 96, now would see the city in this new brief moment as a symbol of the country, that an attack on the World Trade Center would now be seen as an attack on America. Indeed, in part, that could be because it was also an attack on Wall Street, which was, after all, the citadel of American capitalism. But the future of the city would remain uncertain. We're a debtor nation, and in the last years, with the decline, the city was on sale to foreigners. Many of our major hotels, many of our properties are bought up by Arab magnates who have a lot, and by the British, by Asians who have a lot more money than Americans often seem to have. It has become prohibitively expensive, in fact, to working people who often find themselves moving to Orange County, or Westchester County, or Dutchess County, or far reaches of New Jersey. The average home in Manhattan, we're told, is over $1 million, and the values, while they declined last year, have come back. And they're as expensive in the other parts of Manhattan, which we sometimes call Brooklyn. The new Manhattan, as we're told. And that's instructive. We don't call Manhattan the old Brooklyn. Nonetheless, we exist with an old infrastructure, costly to repair. The monies are not likely to come from the state in a public environment that has discredited the public sector and privileges private control. And the city remains trapped in 18th century political boundaries. We're trapped by decisions that were made in the 18th century about where New Jersey begins and where New York ends, and the power that Albany would have. New York City may properly be said to now not be about its political boundaries, but exist as a cultural and intellectual space, as a regional metropolis, as an idea, not simply defined by these tax boundaries, but by its labor market, by the reach of its culture, and by its imagining around the world, as a beacon, much as it always has. Indeed, the city is not in decline. Work has changed and is fundamentally shifting. In the transformation to a global city economy, the work and jobs will no longer be as likely to be in manufacturing. They may be in technologies. They may be in a leisure industry. They will be here. Manufacturing jobs disappear. Financial center is threatened by competitive new centers in the Middle East, Dubai, the Far East, Hong Kong, Singapore, in Europe, London, and Frankfurt. But the growth in consumer goods, finances for international capital, product diversification for corporate control and growth are all in New York. The growth is uneven within the city and its people. It is mostly in Manhattan, but in terms of housing market, we've seen it increasingly in Long Island City and in Brooklyn. The city has still, with its problem, major resources and strengths. Even in privatization, it retains the legacy of its social democratic past, with still probably the strongest public sector of any city in the United States, with a mass transit system that remains the model for the world, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Vast, one fare. It has still CUNY, and it's a city system that provides more opportunities for its residents than any other city system in the country. It still has a city hospital system, albeit one beleaguered. It has a creative cultural center that still attracts new people with ideas. New York City is not a stagnant environment, whether it be for fashion, whether it be for theater, whether it be for cinema. And it has great wealth, both in human capital and in traditions of social experimentation that are still stronger in Lower Manhattan than probably anywhere else. New York has been and remains a place of possibility, of free expression, even as it is alas contested, contained, and likely to be under surveillance. Gay men like the Pakistani seller of safaris can find a haven in New York City, and it's a lesson to the rest of us that hope and possibility still speaks in Manhattan and in New York to the in-between spaces in which our people can strike blows for freedom and survival. And nowhere is that more so than in Greenwich Village, my own hometown. Thank you.
I want to wake up in a city that doesn't sleep.